Hi, it's Christian here. Before we begin this episode, I just wanted to let you know that this is the drumroll, please, 300th episode of the show. When I first started the Human Risk podcast in 2019, I never imagined that I'd get to this many episodes, or indeed have this many listeners. So as we enter the fourth century of this show, I just want to say a big thank you. Whether you've been a guest on the show, you've been listening since the start, or this is the very first time that you've come across it, thank you for being part of the journey. I'm really looking forward to what the next 100 episodes bring. Now, because we've reached that big milestone, it's the perfect excuse to try something a little bit different. With that said, let's roll the intro.
Welcome to Human Risk, a podcast dedicated to the understanding of human behavior as a risk. Here's your host, Christian Hunt.
Hello and welcome back to the show. Now, this is a rather special episode, not just because of the anniversary that I mentioned at the beginning, but also because it's the first of a new mini-series that's exploring the subject of diversity, equity and inclusion with some guests who've got groundbreaking ideas about how to approach the topic. So if those words diversity, equity and inclusion fill you with dread because you've had a bad experience and maybe feel that DE&I is patronizing, pointless, or any number of other negative adjectives, then this mini-series is for you, because this is as far from a traditional discussion of DE&I as you're going to get. The people I'll be speaking to the next few episodes are working together at the cutting edge of this in a way that rejects traditional approaches and avoids the polarization those often create. It's a completely different way of looking at things that I think is incredibly engaging and very powerful, but also really practical and human. My guests for this mini-series are Morgan Hamel, who spent the first 11 years of her career working in the integrity and compliance office of a large company and then became a fashion ethicist, Chloé Valdary, who's the founder of a groundbreaking DE&I approach called the Theory of Enchantment, and Peter Stein, Chloé's partner in the business of the same name. In this mini-series, you'll hear from them individually about their careers and experiences and what got them to think differently about diversity, equity, and inclusion. And we'll get some amazing insights into their way of thinking. But we begin the series with a discussion with all three of them, where they explain how they came together to develop what I think is one of the most interesting ways of helping people with different experiences, perspectives, and backgrounds to respect one another and work and thrive effectively together. To begin the episode, we're going to hear from Morgan. You'll get her full story in a later episode. But for this introduction, I wanted to hear about how she, Chloé, and Peter first met. You'll hear from them later on.
So we have kind of an interesting story, the way that we came together. I had a fashion company called The Garment. And in my leadership of that company, experienced quite significant challenges navigating what I've come to believe is a new era of ethics and reputational risk. And those challenges really hinged quite centrally on navigating diversity, equity, inclusion as it relates to business. And effectively, my business no longer exists because I was ill equipped to navigate what I think is a real challenge for leaders these days. And in the space and time after I made the difficult decision to end my business, I was searching for organizations or companies that were doing diversity, equity, inclusion in a way that captured the spirit of it that I thought I was doing in my business and doing it in a way that was focused on the positive and on genuinely bringing people together rather than taking an approach that was divisive. And a company doing that was surprisingly hard to find. But I found it in Chloé.
So I'm fascinated. This search that you originally did for people that got it, is this just as simple as Googling? How are you going about that? Because there are a lot of people in the space. And I
Mhm.
wondered what processes you'd gone through to filter and how quickly you could identify that people weren't delivering what it was you were looking for.
I certainly did use Google as a tool, although even the question of what words to put in was difficult, right? Inclusion, belonging, like some of those questions, although certainly my search turned up, even using those words, companies that as soon as I began to dig into them, I realized actually some of the things that these organizations are doing with the best of intentions, that approach, I believe, contributed to division that ended up not working well for my business. Only I began to read more that Chloé had written, and also, other thinkers that I then began to discover were sort of adjacent perhaps to her, or continued to explore perspectives that I would say reinforce traditional approaches to diversity, equity, inclusion, and also ones that challenge them. So, for example, John McWhorter wrote a book called Woke Racism that I found fascinating, that sort of called out again, like sort of reinforced this questioning of the traditional approach to DEI in a way that I thought was really interesting and thought provoking. And I felt a resonance with not everything, but many of the things that he shared in that book. And so I sent an email to Theory of Enchantment, sort of expressing a bit about what had happened for me and my desire to connect with Chloé. And I actually didn't hear anything back. And I just kind of thought, well, she's pretty famous. Maybe she doesn't have time for me. And I kind of like left it at that.
Now, as you'll have realised, Morgan, Chloé and Peter did eventually connect. Otherwise, we wouldn't have been recording this episode. But of course, the mischievous side of me really can't resist asking Chloé and Peter whether there wasn't just a small cunning strategy to them ignoring Morgan's original request.
So you decide to get in touch, and then from your perspective, the worst possible thing happens, which is nothing.
Right. Yeah. Shots fired.
And I'll assume, Chloé and Peter, that this is genuine administrative error. It's not that you have to think about this process.
Years.
Not sort of not playing hard to get or anything along those lines. But
No.
Not at all.
It was about, I don't even know how far after that, I received an email to my old fashion inbox a long time after, basically saying, oh my goodness, Morgan, here I am from Theory of Enchantment. We just had a systems change to do with our email, and we are so sorry for this long gap. And sort of to make up for our administrative failure, we would love to offer you a call with Chloé. And I was delighted because at this point I had done much more work in the space of polarization, and the timing actually felt beautifully perfect. And then Chloé and I had our first call, and it actually felt like the perfect time. Like, I actually don't think I was ready to do anything at the time when I didn't hear back. But having researched, having continued my research, and frankly, having been approached and worked with many organizations who have taken the traditional approach to diversity, equity, inclusion, and then find themselves in that practical space of, oh God, this is not working out the way we thought it would. We're really finding ourselves challenged with polarization around this topic. I then had all of these examples that reinforced my own experience of where it wasn't working out as well as, or as seamlessly as the good intentions might have hoped. And so then meeting Chloé and Peter at that time felt perfect, because it then became a place where we could collaborate and try and help these organizations together. And I think our stakeholders as well. So in short, it was very difficult, not easy to find. I've not encountered many, if any, other companies doing diversity, equity, and inclusion the way that Chloé and Peter and Theory of Enchantment do it.
Peter, so lots of people get in touch with you in a similar state. Was this quite unusual in the sense of Morgan's developed her own thinking, has had time to reflect, thanks in part to you, has had a bit more time to reflect on it. Is this a standard sort of approach, or there?
Morgan is a special case for her brilliance, of course, but we get reached out to quite frequently, and it's people from the entire gamut. We have very left-wing administrators in Seattle. We have very right-wing teachers in the rural South. And I think it's the humanist focus of us and the really optimistic tone that we take that attracts the very large middle of America and of the political world. For Morgan specifically, I mean, yeah, so thanks for landing that for us, Morgan, in such a beneficial way for saving our faces. But that was definitely a rather large administrative error that affected not only Morgan, but some other folks as well. And yeah, we were just so glad that we got to engage and re-engage indeed with someone like Morgan, who was already doing something very much aligned with what we're doing, just kind of in a different lane. up there in the 51st state of Canada. So yeah, we were very happy to hear from her and re-engage, and so happy she joined us for a call.
Chloé, talk me through the initial sorts of conversations, because I'm intrigued. You're hearing from someone that's obviously been following you very closely and has probably read deeply, listened, paid attention, even listened to podcasts you wouldn't normally listen to in the quest to discover more. How did those conversations unfold for you? I'm assuming there's delight that someone is coming from a similar place. What's the process for exploring how things might go forward?
Well, I remember being very intrigued by Morgan's story because Morgan had been on, sort of like both sides of the issue in her experience. She experienced what it was like to be a part of a large company and try to, move that company towards focusing on really important issues, including inclusion and belonging. And she had an experience where that was not received well. And she had another experience in her own company where sort of people started to accuse her of not pushing on the very same issues she had pushed for in a previous company. So just having, again, talking about flexibility and adaptability and perspective, just being able to discuss these issues with someone who had been in both of those positions was really delightful to me because it's a perspective that actually most people who come to us don't have. So that was and remains a very unique aspect, I think, of our relationship. And, there's sort of a whole myriad of insights that come from having a interlocutor that has been on both sides of the issue, so to speak. So I'll say that first and foremost. Overall, the process is really, getting to know a person's pain points, what they need, what they're looking for, what they've experienced when being exposed to, let's call it mainstream diversity, equity, and inclusion programs, which typically, in workshops that many consultants give, they, generally speaking, objectify the human being. They say that the human being can only appear in a certain way if they are black, white, gay, straight, etc. Right? There's only one way to be if you are those characteristics or those descriptions. So they reduce the human being and perceive the human being as an object, first and foremost. And also, there's a great deal of what I call ideological capture, right? Which means, like, if the human being can only be one thing, to be good, then the human being can only hold or toe a very specific ideological line as well in order to be good. And any again, reaching across the aisle or consideration of other ideas or perspectives is not just questionable, it's like a form of existential treason, right? And if you dare to question the orthodoxies of these mainstream ideological ideas, then that itself is proof that you are racist. That itself is proof that you are a bigot. And so it's a very, it's a very incoherent system, but it's also very much reinforced. And this causes a lot of problems, not just on the level of of an individual, but also on the level of the organization, right? What happens in an organization when they bring in this toxic way of thinking or being is that now people don't feel like they can speak up. Now people don't feel like they can challenge. And you need the ability to speak up and challenge just from a basic, perspective of business to build robust products and services. You need to be able to do that as a basic thing. And so now what's happening is you have departments and organizations that are able to communicate with each other, right? Because this department over there has been captured. And if I question it, then they're going to accuse me of being a fundamentally bad person. This causes a chilling effect in the organization. And so what was at first an organization, let's say, creating, again, robust products and services for its clients, slowly but surely becomes an organization that is unproductive at best and at worst creating a toxic environment for its employees who slowly but surely become fatigued, stop going to work with this sense of gusto and inspiration that they first had when they first joined the company. It really corrodes an organization. So when we speak with people, we want to get a download of how, like, to what extent is that happening, right? To put all the pieces together and then figure out what products and services we can offer as antidotes to that environment. So usually if an organization, hasn't gone totally off the deep end and there are people within the organization that understand that what's going on is not actually good, that we can get in there early, then we can offer them workshops and practices and suites of practices where they can start to course correct. If an organization, however, and this is especially true if people in the executive teams are kind of captured by the mainstream approach, if the organization is that type of organization, it's actually very difficult to course correct because you can find individuals in the organization that are having issues with how things are going, but they don't have enough power or authority to actually make change. And so those are trickier situations that come up. But so to answer your question overall, we would look for those factors. We would see what products and services we have to offer that can address those pain points, and then we would move together accordingly.
And it's fascinating when you talk like that because I was hearing or thinking about the parallel of radicalization and how far gone is
Mhm.
this organization. And so if we look at other forms of intervention that we might have, it's kind of really assessing where are we on this scale. And I think it's really refreshing that you talk in those terms. Is that a way of looking at it?
I would say it's quite right, Christian. And to Chloe's point, the individual can be radicalized as much as the organization can be radicalized. And that folds into what Morgan does as well in regards to depolarization. There are also some individuals and some organizations, to Chloe's point, that have gone off the deep end, that are too far gone in their radicalization and at least cannot be saved by what we do. But for the most part, most actually organizations, I would say 35 to 45% of our partners, of our customers, indeed, come to us from a place of harm from previous experiences with other conventional DEI practices. And they come to us for healing from those. It's always easiest to start with a partner, to start with a customer, of course, before they've been harmed. But in the event that they have been harmed, many, 35 to 45% roughly, do come to us to heal from that. And we're, yeah, we feel quite, I don't know if the word is privileged, but grateful that people see that sort of trust in us. To answer your question, Christian, about radicalization, yeah, that really, really deeply harms organizations and individuals in those organizations in the way that Chloe just outlined. And I think that's also something that Morgan faces kind of on the regular as well, likely up there in Canada.
So I wanted to share really briefly just a quick thought in which I've experienced or hopefully helped organizations to see the way in which there may be their stakeholders have different views on this than they think, right? So one of the things that I've realized is many executive teams will think that they all have the same belief about all of this stuff and that all their stakeholders do too, but actually tapping into their stakeholders, whether it's their employees or their members or their customers, and asking them the question of, how well equipped do you feel to navigate polarization, or how do you see polarization showing up within your organization? Which I have people write down when I do a big speech, I'll have them write down on a recipe card, like, how is this showing up? And the number of cards that we get from both sides where people are saying there is too much of this or there's not enough. I find that showing that to the executives and to the board really helps them realize, like, oh, wait, maybe we're not all on the same page here. And it's worthwhile to take a look at how we might move forward. So I just wanted to share that because I think that having that data, even if it's not representative of the entire organization, sort of helps like snap people out of it if we're thinking from a radicalization perspective, and then kind of pushing the limit a bit and asking, if, for example, many of our states don't like our current approach to diversity, equity, inclusion, does it matter? Like, does it matter? And that question really forces organizations to think like personally about their own beliefs, but also about the connection between their diversity, equity, inclusion strategy and their actual business success in a way that is uncomfortable, but of critical importance. And we saw that out in the Bud Light situation and
Sure.
many other examples more recently where organizations have sort of flip-flopped on diversity, equity, inclusion because of, I would say, a lack of understanding of the views of their stakeholders and also a lack of preparedness or um, appreciation for the very fast way in which this risk can present itself and a for how to navigate it. Because of my background in ethics, but also in business and running my own company, I have a pretty good sense of the places where some of these either social and or environmental initiatives can press up against a business's self-interest, need to make money in a very real way. And some of the things with that I see with traditional diversity, equity, inclusion initiatives sometimes I would say fail to take into account the reality of implementing some of these initiatives, which can be very messy, very challenging, and again, often is done with the best of intentions, but not the future is sometimes not thought of in terms of what does this actually look like. And so I was interested in finding an organization that does this in a way that organizations can actually do, and that where they won't find themselves kind of having to do a boomerang reversal on their targets because they've made commitments that are then very difficult to honor.
And so flipping the conversation to the other side, Morgan, talk us through your experience of it, because you finally got to speak to her and you know that this is, you want to hear more because you're convinced, but how did it unfold for you?
So the interaction with Chloe and then afterwards having the opportunity to also meet Peter, I would say was yet another kind of reinforcement of I'm not alone here in kind of questioning the traditional approaches to or conventional approaches to diversity, equity, inclusion. And so I would say that felt like a real, almost kind of homecoming of like, wow, this feels really great to find people who, again, might not think exactly the same as I do. And that is okay and actually kind of great because we can push each other, but who are approaching this topic with a level of depth and curiosity and rigor that I had been seeking. So I would say it was just really wonderful to meet them both and then to hear more about the ways in which their clients have struggled with implementation of conventional diversity, equity, inclusion, which of course I was from my own side in my polarization work. And I think we're a really interesting sort of complement for one another because in many ways, as Chloe articulated, my story, the story of being on both sides, if we call it that, of this topic, really does help leadership teams and boards and organizations have conversations about this topic with people who are from both sides. And that is, I think, something I sort of have those initial conversations and facilitate engagement around where is it hard. And then Chloe and Peter have, again, I hesitate to call it a solution because of the complexity, but something to offer to move the needle in a more positive direction. And so to find them was a real gift.
One of the things that strikes me, Morgan, in your journey thus far is must be a degree of loneliness in the sense that given what you had been
Mm.
through, a very, very personal experience. And I wondered whether, and obviously you'd had other conversations, what did you think? But I wondered whether did this feel very much like you'd found your tribe, the people that because obviously you can speak to people that are but you're looking for a solution, a way of thinking at the world. Does it feel like, I don't want to quite say you sort of feel like you've come home, but it must have felt less lonely that you're not the only one thinking in these terms, and you've got some people you can really talk to on a different level, I guess. Is
Yes,
that how it felt?
absolutely. I would say you've captured it beautifully, Christian. That feeling of loneliness certainly, well, it's gotten better in through meeting people like Chloé and Peter and some others who are doing this work. It still exists. And in fact, I have to share, this morning I was kind of having a moment of feeling a bit discouraged, thinking, this approach that I'm advocating, this sort of depolarized approach to business and a sort of return back to, I hesitate to call it old school business ethics, but that was kind of what I was raised with. This idea of business ethics being code of conduct and all of the traditional elements of what an ethics program and an ethical culture should be. It's not quite a return to that, because my perspective is that we can't not go back to that given this new environment. But it is a approach that advocates that it's okay for organizations to draw a line and set a boundary around what they will and will not do when it comes to particular topics, given their overall purpose and mission, whatever it may be. And I actually drafted a letter. I call it the stakeholder letter. It's basically a letter on behalf, sort of written by me on behalf of a fictional CEO that outlines this approach. And I shared it on LinkedIn a couple of days ago, and it got some great reception. But still, I was feeling kind of like, I was still a bit alone in this. And this morning, I received a note from the chair of the board of a large corporation who basically said, I saw your letter. I've been following your work. I shared it with our management team, and they said it makes complete sense. So I was grateful to have received that note, and I am continuing to work to find the tribe that I actually feel is really large. When Peter articulated that sort of large group in the middle, there are very many people. And I think when we actually talk to one another, most times off of LinkedIn, or, off of social media, we actually find that many people, and I would say most, are in this more moderate middle, and there's a lot of opportunity there.
And if I may chime in on that, to the point of loneliness, I actually think I'm realizing in this conversation that might be one of the primary reasons that I got started with Theory of Enchantment, reaching out to them and actually volunteering for a while, because I thought the work that they did, and obviously still do, is so pioneering, so different and so needed. And I felt alone. And I thought, oh my God, finally a hand to hold in that sense. And we as an organization have heard from so many people, I think Chloé mentioned this, that when there has been reasonably complete ideological capture of an organization, that, to your point, Morgan, does not mean that everyone in the organization thinks that way. And in fact, most people don't, but they're not able to speak because they know they're definitely not going to be heard, and they definitely are going to be punished. And we hear from employees of organizations you would be shocked at who are experiencing this and feel dreadfully alone in their organization, despite being surrounded by people that very likely think and feel like them, but they're unable to communicate that in that incredibly punitive environment. In fact, just the other day, it was literally 2 weeks ago, I had a conversation with someone, and she was simply searching for somewhere to talk about these things in a way that didn't feel like she was in a prison camp or something. And we talked about some of the in-person experiences that we're actually going to be holding in the fall, that we're launching in the fall, and some of our other products that have community built into them digitally. But the issue of loneliness, I think is massive here. And it, not to belabor a point, but I think it has a lot to do with the information infrastructure that we have these days, being social media and legacy media that is debasing itself, trying to compete with social media for the attention of everyone. And in that sense, we have an incredibly small minority of voices that are able to speak and being heard. And in that sense, that vast middle that you talked about, Morgan, feels alone despite being shoulder to shoulder almost all the time with people that are much more like them than they might think. So that I think that the opportunity of forming community or communities at this point is actually rather large. And
Mhm.
I hope more organizations join us, frankly, in coming into the fold just to form those communities so that people feel less alone. And maybe through that, they feel a little bit more secure. And in themselves, when they feel secure, they're going to be showing up in ways that are more emotionally regulated for them and ways that are more emotionally regulating for others around them.
It strikes me there's two dynamics here. The first one is knowing that you're not alone. So the loneliness point, having the courage just so that you feel that you are able to speak. And you're providing people with a solution, a way of looking at the world. So it's not just saying, actually, there's something not quite right here. You're actually saying, well, here's a way forward. Here's a way that we can square the circle, if you like. But a key component of this struck me is just permission to even open the door, to even think about the subject. So just the fact that you exist and are having these conversations, I think is comforting to people, even if you don't understand the detail. The fact that someone's out there saying, well, there might be a different way of looking at this. That's just permission to challenge. It strikes me as often because I think there's a lot of people out there intuitively that work for organizations that something's not quite right. And maybe they don't have the full bandwidth to work it out or the experience to work it out or to know where to research these things, but they're not comfortable. And so even just the fact that you exist gives people permission to feel like they can ask questions and think about things.
You could not be more right, Christian. And I think for us, for Theory of Enchantment, perhaps for Morgan too, the deeply tragic event and events that have happened since October 7th in regards to the Israel-Palestine conflict have driven a lot of that polarized, divisive sort of overhang over people. And that has subsequently driven a lot of organizations and individuals to us to simply find ways to have conversations about that specific conflict, the Israel-Palestine conflict. And that, I mean, I think Chloé can speak to that much more, but in terms of it seems like we are in a absolute perfect storm in the United States, this being an election year and this being a year that's held most of that conflict. And on the one hand, the notion that we have not totally broken apart yet is indeed, I think, an accomplishment in my eyes. On the other side of that, it certainly seems we're on the brink, to call it a title of, I think, a Sam Harris podcast. And I would invite everyone, individuals and organizations, to join us in the movement towards a more pluralistic, humanist kind of future in this regard.
Fascinating stuff. And I'm intrigued how the conversation between you all progressed. So there's the initial meeting of minds, a recognition that this is going to work, right? That there's a willingness, ability to engage. Did the collaboration that you've got just come naturally, or did you have to think about that? How did that work?
Well, it's ongoing, as this podcast proves. And no, I would say we didn't have to think about it. It's just it literally is just a question of collaborating and working together and seeing how we can put our minds together to help the various people who come into both of our fields and see how we can both bring areas of expertise in tandem with each other's to help those who come to us. So the collaboration has felt like a perfect fit to me. Morgan, how do you feel about that?
Absolutely, Chloe. I would say, I remember in one of our early conversations, Peter saying something along the lines of, the details we'll figure out later, but obviously this is going to happen. And it was just such a natural fit. And as Chloe shared, we continue to engage in different ways. Chloe and I are leading a board session together next week to help a board talk through some of the challenges that exist around this topic. I think having external folks help to facilitate those conversations is really valuable, because my experience is that, in line with what we were talking about around people being within organizations, feeling like they're alone, it can be very, and I would say in most cases is very difficult for an individual, uh, again, on either side, if we want to call it that, this topic, to voice concern or a question or a wonder about anything related to this topic. It can feel very risky and is indeed very risky. And so my experience is having one come in, as Chloe and I are doing, and helping boards or executive teams navigate and practice having those conversations in a respectful way, in the same way that Chloe did with Jordan Peterson, is something that feels welcome, because in many cases the tension is there, and it's just a matter of having skilled facilitators to help facilitate that conversation.
Now, when I was doing my research for this series, there was one interview that Chloe did, which I thought was fascinating and worth exploring in the context of this discussion. It's had a big impact on Morgan as well. And that's because the person that Chloe spoke to was Dr. Jordan Peterson, who invited her onto his show. Now, if you're not familiar with Jordan Peterson, he's a Canadian psychologist, professor, and author known for his critiques of political correctness and his work on self-help, personal responsibility, and the psychology of belief. He's a controversial figure due to his opposition on compelled speech, on gender pronouns, critiques of progressive social movements, and views on traditional gender roles, which have sparked both strong support and intense criticism. It's possibly not the kind of show that you necessarily expect to see or hear Chloe appear on, which is why I think this is really interesting, and I wanted to hear why she'd chosen to do it. But to begin with, here's Morgan talking about when she first came across the episode.
The first exposure I had to Chloe was from an interview that a friend sent me of Jordan Peterson interviewing Chloe. And I have to say that, I mean, even when I received the link to that interview, I had a belief about Jordan Peterson and about him as a person and about his ideas and his work, that, first of all, his ideas were bad. And second of all, that kind of because of that, he was a bad person. And I remember even feeling like in my body, the feeling of like, like, "Mm, I don't want to listen to this." But I thought this is actually, it was posing a really interesting question, which, if I remember correctly, was along the lines of, are all people racist? Which I thought was really interesting and worth asking. And so I listened to this podcast, heard Jordan Peterson and Chloe have a robust, respectful, thoughtful, intellectual debate. And I thought, first of all, this woman is brilliant and I want to know her and more about her company. And second of all, this man is much more interesting and actually maybe not bad.
The process of listening to someone that you might not ordinarily want to listen to is, of course, very on brand for the subject that we're talking about, but requires a level of commitment. And I'm wondering whether the act of having to do that must have made you feel even more this was the right thing, because what you're seeing there is actually the practice of the theory. This is a conversation that reflects the spirit of it. And so if you were looking for, albeit one with potentially not the name you would want to look for, but the sort of substance of what you're seeing
Yes.
is confirmation that this is the right place for you.
Yes. Yeah, I would say that that's true. And it is indeed, as you outline, Christian, a practice and something that is quite difficult to do and difficult to talk about. I mean, frankly, even me voicing that name on this podcast is a risk for me.
And so we've got this amazing interview, and I'll put links to that in the show notes because I'd really encourage people to dive into it. And Morgan, how was your reaction to what you were hearing?
I would say, Christian, that what it did for me, there were several things, but the most powerful thing I think it did for me was hearing Chloe and also Jordan talk about some of the elements of, we can decide what to call it, but sort of traditional diversity, equity, inclusion that are potentially problematic. And having that so closely mirrored my own experience of at the garment, of where I saw the ways in which things were not as I had hoped that they would be when put into practice. And so what it did for me was kind of reinforce, I'm not the only one who thinks there's something off here. and then offered a beautiful, I'm not going to call it a solution, but sort of practice or alternative to the traditional approaches to diversity, equity, inclusion. Because I didn't want to stop doing diversity, equity, inclusion if we call it that. I'm not even sure that's the right thing to call it. But I did feel very strongly that there had to be a better way. And I found that in Chloe and Theory of Enchantment.
And I guess that brings us beautifully, Chloe. The way I've just described that and the way Morgan's talked about it, this is the essence of what you're saying, right? This is you living your values.
So yes, it's interesting that interview now such a long time ago. And I remember the night before or the day before, I actually fasted to prepare for that interview. So I did a water fast, meaning I only drank water for 24 hours to prepare for that interview. And that was for a myriad of reasons. I really never actually perceived Jordan Peterson as a monster in a way that many others have perceived him. So I wasn't going into that interview with a lot of the anxiety or sense of defensiveness that people who, originally didn't like him might have gone into it with. There were elements of his earlier lectures that I really appreciated, and I have come to hold certain critiques of the way he presents himself today. So my understanding of him has, I think, always been pretty nuanced. And also there are elements of what he had been saying in the past that I admired and appreciated in terms of his take. And, there are moments where we disagreed on that or throughout that interview. So being able to model healthy disagreements and being able to really treat each other sacredly, even while disagreeing with each other, was the ultimate thing that we were trying to model. And it's the ultimate thing that we tried to teach in the Theory of Enchantment.
So as we look at that, presumably not an intentional tactic of yours to go out looking for these things, but if people are coming to you, then you're going to engage with them.
Yeah, absolutely. And we're going to be really honest, as Morgan said, about how difficult it is to do this because as human beings, we move towards what is familiar and we are often caught up in the feeling of threat when we are encountering the unfamiliar. This is just how we are wired on an evolutionary level. Biologically, neurobiologically, this is how we are wired. And when we encounter someone who has a viewpoint that we disagree with vehemently, the idea of speaking with them often fills us with a sense of dread as human beings. It fills us with a sense of almost as if our sense of like who we are is under attack. Like, who am I? Am I a good person if I talk to this person? Am I a good person if I reach out across the aisle and engage in dialogue with this person? So those are some of the things that naturally come up for us as human beings. And a lot of the modalities and practices in the Theory of Enchantment are set up to sort of lower that sense of threat, help us lower that sense of threat, help us be in the present moment when we're dialoguing both with ourselves and with others, and to make that move and reach across the aisle and feel the fear but do it anyway. And notice that as we continue to practice over and over again, it actually gets that much easier.
And indeed, as a practice of our first principle, right? I think Jordan Peterson is, as Chloe mentioned, a nuanced character, as we all are, but also someone who's put out as quite a political abstraction in a sense, maybe a monster, maybe something else. And our first principle is don't treat people like political abstractions, treat them as human beings. Jordan Peterson is definitely a human being. Whether you listen to that podcast with Jordan Peterson and Chloe, or you read some of his books, you will indeed discover the humanness of him. And that will make it easier to engage with him or engage with other people that you might have otherwise thought of as political abstractions. But I thought that was a really pioneering move by Chloe to have that interview and at a time when Jordan Peterson was at his height. And in that sense, Jordan Peterson being at his height, many people were screaming his name in very pejorative ways. So it was quite bold for Chloe to do that and show our principles by doing so.
And I'm assuming that this is about engaging in people in good faith. So there would presumably be limits. It wouldn't just be have a conversation with anyone. They need to come to the table in good faith with you. And that was the basis on which you approached this, because there was a sense that he was, I guess, because you'd done the research, you looked at it, there was a sense that he was capable of engaging in the way that you were suggesting.
Well, listen, I mean, the truth is Jordan Peterson came to me. So his team reached out to me. Uh, his team had heard about the theory of enchantment and they were intrigued. They had no idea, or my impression was that he had no idea that I had actually been following his work for a long time. I was really taken aback by Maps of Meaning, which is the first book that he wrote. And I was also I was like really compelled when watching his lectures that took place at the University of Toronto in 2013, that book was then based on. So I, again, had already admired some of his paradigms and some of the things that he spoke about. So I did not enter into the conversation with animosity. I actually entered into the conversation with both nervousness because it's Jordan Peterson and admiration because it's Jordan Peterson. But I was also aware of the fact that the environment that we were speaking in was fraught, right? With many people who perceived him as a political abstraction, perceived him as a monster. So I was aware of that. But I wanted to model, love and compassion, which is another principle of ours to root everything we do in love and compassion. So I wanted to be in the conversation and model the conversation in a way that reflected those two values. But more to your question, more directly to your question, Christian, you definitely want to approach with good faith. You want to be discerning, right? In terms of like whether or not the other person is actually coming to you in good faith. And you also want to be humble and recognizing that not everyone is going to come to you in good faith, right? And that's okay. You don't have to have a conversation with everyone. Like that's not what we're saying. So to have the wherewithal to be able to discern whether or not someone is coming to you in good faith is really important, but also to be open enough and to recognize that even though sometimes a person might not be coming to you in good faith at the moment, there's always the possibility of change. They can always change their mind. And as long as you are working on yourself, or I am working on myself to remain flexible and curious and vulnerable, then that doorway is always open. But we are not, we're not suggesting that people go out and, insist on having conversations with people who are not coming in good faith.
I love that, Chloe. And just to add to that, what you shared around, I'm working on myself to remain flexible. I love that. And I think, this idea of getting curious, as I know you encourage people to do through Theory of Enchantment, about how does the person I'm about to engage with see themselves as on the side of good, right? Like,
Mhm.
how do they see themselves on the side of good? Because as humans, we have such a deep desire and need for ourselves to be good people and to be seen as good. And so getting curious about whatever the context might be, like assuming that the person is coming into that conversation, viewing themselves as on the side of good, which my experience is almost always they are.
Mhm.
And that's actually a really interesting window into either changing their mind because I can learn more information that might help my point or the way in which I argue. But in my experience, what often ends up happening is that actually my own mind is changed. Like I actually find
Mhm.
myself coming closer to their perspective in a way that I didn't expect. And I've actually found it to be fascinating and delightful, as
Mhm.
opposed to kind of like, oh no, I'm going to have to switch sides.
Mhm.
More of the approach of this perspective is one of a million or many billions that is only serving to enhance my understanding of the vast complexity of this challenge. And knowing this
Mhm.
perspective actually makes me stronger. It
Mhm.
makes me, puts me in a better position to be strategic or navigate this as opposed to, oh no, I'm going to have to switch sides.
Mhm. Yes, it increases your ability to adapt, right? I mean, that's another way to think about switching sides, quote unquote. And I love that these are just sounds coming out of our face holes, right? That we're using to try to describe some process. or to approximate some process. But yeah, like another way of saying switching sides is just adaptability, right? Your ability to adapt, your ability to digest or metabolize new information so that you can take in the complexity of life itself, right? That's an incredibly important. I mean, it's actually an understatement to say it's an incredibly important skill set, but that's really what we're talking about ultimately.
I'm struck by the idea of you coming in with a very powerful combination of this deep intellectual thought and research has gone into this.
Hmm.
And then you've got that practical element as well of someone that's lived this. You've both put a lot of energy into this in different ways. And so you're bringing, there's a depth there, I guess, that if somebody wanted to challenge it on the intellectual level, you have that capability to have that conversation. But there's also well, you haven't lived, you've dealt with both of those things. And I think that's a very powerful combination because often if people don't, that people find any excuse not to do something or not to participate or not to listen to something, they will find whatever angle they can. And what I think is interesting about the combination of the two of you is you've kind of covered both the bases off because you've lived it and you've thought about it. That's a very powerful combination. I'm struggling to see what the chinks in the armor might be in terms of how you critique it because you sort of say we've covered the bases off, and so there's a beautiful. You bring very different experiences.
Yeah, I would actually say it's so foolproof because it takes viewpoint diversity very sincerely. I was doing a workshop in California a number of weeks ago, and I have a number of slides that I show where we talk about what it means to be human, and we actually showcase some of the leaders of the civil rights movement in the United States who talked about these issues. And I put a quote on screen from James Baldwin, who's one of those individuals. And I gave the context for the quote, and I talked about what James Baldwin was responding to. And I said, now I want you to tell me, do you agree with what he is saying or do you disagree? And that was the first time I had like done that in that way. And the circumstances were, there were fewer people in the room, so I had more time to really, really work with the material. And it was so refreshing. It felt so refreshing to be able to ask that question because I wanted to know what they thought, not what their friends thought, not what the social media platforms that they're on think, what they think they're supposed to think. I wanted to really challenge them and encourage them to tell me what they thought. Because if you really believe in the sacredness of the human being, that is how you approach it, right? Because I can learn something from them, they can learn something from me. It's an open experience, and I really do believe that you know the orientation of curiosity that we're trying to engender both in ourselves and in others, it gives birth, it truly does give rise to things like viewpoint diversity, right? Which is not just a kind of throwaway phrase. It doesn't work if it's just a throwaway phrase. It doesn't work if by viewpoint diversity you simply mean I get to counter you because what you're saying is I don't like it. Like I don't like the way it sounds. Viewpoint diversity is something that can only come out of genuine curiosity about yourself and the other person's lived experience that you're speaking with. Not in a way that uses it for manipulation or exploitation, which we've certainly seen in mainstream DEI settings, but in a way that is genuinely deeply curious, deeply compassionate, deeply loving, which all of which require practice. You're practicing a way of being, and that's not a set of definitions that you can memorize, right? That's not a set of propositions that you can simply repeat ad nauseum. It really requires a practice, which is why what you're saying, Christian, works so well. It is, the intellectual deep, but it is also the lived experience, and it's the marrying of the two that produces great things.
And I think that's the perfect note on which to end this first episode of the mini-series, which means I get to say thank you so much to Morgan, Chloé, and Peter for appearing on the 300th episode of the show, and also to you for listening. This episode is just a taste of what's to come in this mini-series, and the three of them will be back on episodes individually. So in those future episodes, we'll hear more about their stories and what led them to do what they do now. Morgan will talk about her experiences at the Garment, and you'll hear a lot more from Chloé and Peter about the theory of enchantment, what it is, and why it's so powerful. Those episodes will be out very soon, but in the meantime, you can find out more about the work they're doing together on depolarization and diversity, equity, and inclusion via the links in the show notes. And once you've done that, you can also discover episodes of the show that you might have missed. There are, after all, 299 other ones that you can catch up on. You can discover those via the show's website, which is humanriskpodcast.com. Coming up next will be my individual discussions with each of the people that you've just met. But for now, stay safe and remember that listening and talking to people that you might disagree with can produce some astonishing benefits. But above all, thank you so much for listening.